I do think, Sam and Ryan, that the Burge Report is my favorite podcast that I do. I mean, I do ROL. This is a part of ROL, but I'm talking specifically about the Burge Report. I do the Church Answers podcast, so I do 4 a week regularly, and then this one in addition to it. And I like it just because I'm such a fanboy, Ryan. It just comes down to that.
I thought you liked it because I did all the talking, Thom, and you can just sit back and watch me flail around.
I like that too. And Sam does most of the talking in the other podcast. And I like that too. But Church Answers podcast, Jess is coming to help me. So we'll see how we do there. We're going to talk about something that you have been bold enough to mention. It's the white evangelical Democrats. Where have all the white evangelical Democrats gone? Sung to the tune of Peter, Paul, and Mary. Where have all the flowers gone? Where have all the white evangelical Democrats gone? And I think it's pretty fascinating. I mean, this whole thing of connecting the politics of someone to the religion of someone. Well, we'll get into that. But let's thank Tithe Lee. Tithe Lee is paying the bills for the Burge Report. They are our friends. The Dios, Dean Sweetman, is just incredible guy. All of their team is. They have 40,000 churches using Tithe Lee for online text giving, managing their people's information, volunteer management, child check-in, church apps, websites, a whole lot more. Hey, just go check out Tithe Lee at tithely.com or look in the show notes. And while you're there, they're offering a free report called the 2023 State of Church Giving Report. You can access that report by clicking on the link as well. It's a very good report. Sam, we've had a good relationship with Tithe Lee, and we appreciate this connection as well.
Yeah, they've been a great partner. They have a good resource with this 2023 State of Church Giving, and they provide incredible services for the church too. So you should definitely give Tithe Lee a look. We appreciate their sponsorship, but we also just appreciate what they do for churches.
Ryan, as we are releasing this podcast, we're 6 or 7 weeks away from the presidential election.
Yeah.
So people listening to this,
Jesus,
some white guy.
Yeah. Some old white guy. Some old white guy is going to win. That is a fact. I know that without a shadow of a doubt. I'll bet the house on that.
And so in the midst of this, you're talking about where have all the white evangelical Democrats gone? And here are 3 white evangelicals talking about these white evangelical Democrats. Hey, where did you get this? I shouldn't ask you where you get the data because you go all over the place to gather this information.
Yeah, this one comes from the General Social Survey, which is like, thank you, taxpayers of America, for funding this, the National Science Foundation. It's been part of like the science funding budget of America for 50 years now. Mm-hmm. And I mean, sometimes I sit back and think, if we did not have this, where would social science be? Quantitative social science especially. And the answer is we would not be nearly as far as we are right now, because when someone asks me, like, where are we today versus where we were 30 years ago, it's really the only resource I have when it comes to religion. I mean, there's surveys out there, like the American National Election Study started in 1948, but it was like really a political science survey, so more focused on voting and that kind of stuff. There's like the Cooperative Election Study, which is great, but it also started in 2008, so it only gives us a 15-year window. This one, and it doesn't ask that much about religion either. It asks like 4 questions about religion. The General Social Survey asks a lot more questions about religion, and it goes back to 1972. Now, I will say this. I just had a nice conversation with someone last week about a large organization wants to fund an annual American religion survey that's going to be longitudinal and start up next year. That's going to allow us to track religion with a specificity we never had before on a large scale over a long period of time. And they want me to help consult on the project. And can I tell you, that was probably some of the best news I've heard this year, is that there's going to be another option for whoever comes after me in 20 years is going to have another option that did not exist when I started doing this work. And that's so great, because now we can understand the world in a way that we can't understand it right now. So
when that vast longitudinal information becomes available on a usable scale, I'll be dead.
Sorry, Thom.
Yeah.
Well, I'll be close to retired at that point. By the time it gets to be like, like I'm 42, I'm gonna do this for 15 more years and I'm out the door. So I get 15 years of it, I guess, which is better than nothing. But imagine a grad student who's like, 10 years old now. They're going to have all this information that we don't have. It kind of makes me jealous, because They get all these options that we don't have. Now, if they don't take advantage of them, I'm going to haunt them from my grave, but that's a different story.
Well, give us a story about the white evangelical Democrat. And I know that this is not a political commentary, even though it's dealing with politics.
It is definitely not a political commentary. When I write about politics, people have to understand I'm just telling you what the data says. I do not have a dog in the fight. My job is to describe the world as it is, not the way I wish it to be or hope it to be. So let's just be very clear here. I'm being descriptive, not prescriptive, right? That's and I tell my students that our job is just to describe the world as objectively as possible. And one of the biggest movements is the fact that there used to be a whole bunch of white evangelical Democrats, and now there are not a whole bunch of white evangelical Democrats. Before 1970, there were more white evangelical Democrats and there were white evangelical Republicans. How about that? Tom, you remember those days?
Hey, can I tell you a quick story?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I'm born in the deep South, Alabama. Born and raised in Alabama. I was in a county still called Bullock County, Bullock. Population at the time for the total county was about 15,000, and that would have been the 1960 census. I left there in 72, 73, and 63% African American. So you knew there's one side of town, quite frankly, that was the white side. The other side of town was the black side. And you can imagine where the poverty was and where the poverty was not. Well, of those whites on the white side, there were only, and that would have been, I'm trying to do the number, 3,000 or 4,000. There would have been only 2 families that were Republican. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Every other white family was a Democrat.
And the historical context for that, by the way, is that's the FDR coalition. Because, yes. I mean, the South was in absolute dire straits during the Great Depression. They got it worse than the North did in many, many ways. And so when FDR's New Deal came through, they did things like the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which basically paid farmers to kill pigs and throw them in the ditch to try to drive the price. It's a wild story to tell, but it's historically accurate because the price of pork had fallen so low that, farmers there was no reason to raise pigs anymore. So they thought, well, let's kill some of the pigs, throw them in the ditch. That'll raise the price of pork and we'll pay the farmers for killing the pigs so they'll survive. And for a lot of farmers in the South, without that program, they would have gone belly up. They would have starved to death and their families would have starved to death. And also, the Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration all put these men to work doing things like digging tunnels and bridges and lakes and building libraries and things like that. And so a lot of people in the South were big FDR folks because they thought that FDR is the one that saved them from the worst part of the Great Depression and also led them against the Nazis in World War II as well. And so even in the 1960s and 70s, a lot of them still had party allegiance to the Democrats for what happened in the mid 1930s because they were still alive. They carried that forward and tried to inculcate that in their children, but their children obviously went a different direction, especially in the 1970s and 80s, and abandoned the partisanship of their parents and grandparents.
What happened?
Now, Dad, I want to clarify. Our family was one of those 2 families
that
was registered Republican.
Yes.
And I just want to clarify. And
your father, the other family,
the M Fingers was the other family.
The M Fingers was the other family.
And your father, my grandfather, was a white mayor of the town who supported civil rights. So, just a little tidbit there, and a little background. You kind of left that part out.
I'm editing your Wikipedia right now, by the way, Tom. I'm putting this in your Wikipedia.
Well, there's a little more to the story. Let's just put Ryan aside for a little while. Let's just talk, Sam. There's a little more to the story. My father had a political nemesis, and they would shout at each other on the courthouse steps. And the political nemesis, my dad was the mayor, the white mayor of a dominant African-American town. And the circuit judge was a guy by the name of George C. Wallace. And he lived in the county adjoining. He lived in Barber County next to Bullock County, but his circuit was over Bullock County. And my dad despised George Wallace. And I remember him yelling at him one time on the courthouse steps, "George, you're just a little Jesus. You think you're the answer to everything." I mean, I've got memories of my dad and the first true segregationist candidate for president, I guess, in history, at a major stage anyway. So, Ryan, are you with us?
I'm here. I was getting ready to tell you the story about how this changed, Sam and Tom, about why the Southern whites became Republicans. Do you guys know this story? It involves Lyndon Johnson. The Civil Rights Act of
please
1960.
share.
Yeah. So the white population in the South were Democrats until the mid 1960s, and then Lyndon Johnson, who was a Democrat, by the way, a Texas Democrat, and very conservative in some ways, but actually very liberal in other ways, especially on issues of racial justice. He signed the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 1964 and 1965. Martin Luther King Jr. was at the signing ceremony. Bill Moyers, who did the PBS show for a long time.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, he was one of
used
Lyndon
to be a
Johnson.
Southern Baptist.
Yeah, exactly. He was one of Lyndon Johnson's close advisors. And when he got on the plane, Lyndon Johnson said to him, "Son, I think I just gave away the South." And he was right. And so what happened was over time, and then this really accelerated what we call the Southern strategy, which is this kind of political movement by the Republican Party to talk about race without actually talking about race. There's a guy named Lee Atwater. There's a great documentary called Boogeyman about Lee Atwater, who might be one of the worst human beings ever.
Died of a brain tumor.
Yeah, died of a brain tumor.
Right.
Really a wretched human being. Like he would say, like, you can't come out and say the N-word, but what you can say is talk about things like welfare and busing, because it's like talking about race without actually talking about race. You got to be subtle about it. And so Nixon really began to adopt the Southern strategy and talk about race without talking about race, and shifted the votes of white evangelicals in the South from being Democrats in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s to being Republicans in the 1970s. And by the time the 1980s rolled around, with Ronald Reagan, we basically are close to where we are today with the political realignment happening, where white evangelicals are overwhelmingly Republicans, are voting for Republicans. Now, what's interesting, though, and I think actually the upshot of the whole piece is there were still a lot of white evangelicals who said they were Democrats, but voted for Republicans on election day, even through the 1990s, because they still had that I can't be a Republican, but I'm going to vote for Reagan. And I can't be a Republican, but I got to vote for Dole over Clinton, or Bush over Clinton. So what we've actually seen in the last 15 years is the gap between partisanship and voting behavior has minimized amongst white evangelicals, and now they identify as Republicans and vote for Republicans on election day. For a long time, it was they only voted for Republicans, but they still identified as Democrats. I think that's the big switch is, and I think predicated all that is older white evangelicals died off, and their kids were less attached to the Democratic label because they have no memory of FDR and the New Deal and all those things. And so now they're like, no, I've got no reason to be a Democrat. And so now what we're seeing is just kind of like voting behavior is now lining up with partisanship. And so that's where we are today, is 80% of white evangelicals will vote for Donald Trump in 2024 because that's the share that voted for him in 2020.
Wow.
Brian, you put out a tweet that I found rather humorous when it comes to Southern Baptists and how they were broken pretty evenly between Democrats and Republicans as late as 2008. In fact, if I remember the tweet correctly, I don't have it in front of me, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, but it was an even split. 41% of Southern Baptists were Democrats, 41% were Republicans at the 2008 election. Now, as you said, some obviously would vote differently than their party affiliation, but party affiliation, though a lagging indicator, still an important indicator. I loved some of the responses that were put out there because if I remember right, I retweeted it or I engaged with the tweet, and somebody in particular said, "I don't believe you." I don't know how many times you get that when you present facts. It's like, this is not true. I don't believe you. And it's like, how do I can't argue with that. These are the facts. It's like 2 + 2 = 4. I don't believe you. These are not right. It's like, I don't even know what to say. So walk us through a little bit about that dynamic, not necessarily Southern Baptists, although you can use them as an example if you like. But as things changed from the 80s, 90s into the 2000s, like what was happening with evangelicalism?
So I think we've got to be fair to both sides here. And one is that white evangelicalism, and I wrote a post about this on my Substack last week that I'm sure got me in a lot of trouble with certain people. The post was the Southern Baptist Convention has never been more conservative than it is right now.
You got Sam in trouble.
Yeah, I know it got Sam in trouble. But it's a fact. It's an empirical fact. Like, you can say whatever you want about whatever you want. But when I see this, like, we got to stop the liberal drift, I want to go, what are you talking about? Empirically, there is no evidence If anything, there's evidence of the opposite. Like there is 75% of Southern Baptists now say the Bible is literally true. That's the highest it's ever been since they started asking the question 40 years ago. So where are all these liberal Southern Baptists hanging out that I can't seem to find in any survey that I do anymore? I mean, they are more unified today than ever before. Now, I will say there's two things about that. One is the fact that I think that evangelicals have just become more conservative over time. But the other is obviously the Democratic Party's moved to the left. I mean, let's just be clear about that. The Democratic Party, it makes it more and more difficult to be a person of faith and be a Democrat, every day, it feels like in some ways. So it's what we call, there's like push and pull factors. Like there's, in some ways, the Democrats pushed the white evangelicals to become Republicans. But in some ways, the evangelicals pulled themselves toward the Republican side. I mean, I remember growing up and our church was very pro-immigrant. We talked a lot about religious persecution and wanting to welcome people into our country. And now you see the modern iteration of the Republican Party is the most virulently anti-immigrant that I've ever seen. And the data backs this up, by the way. I mean, if you look at the question on deportation, a larger share of Americans want to deport all illegal immigrants today than any point in the last 20 years. So, I had a conversation where someone goes, oh, the problem is the Democrats have become more extreme. And I'm like, no, both parties have become more extreme. You just want to look at the other party and say it's their fault. I didn't move. They moved. And it's like, no. Both parties have moved. You just chose to hitch your wagon to one of those two parties as it moved, which makes the other party feel further away. So obviously it's complex, but I just don't see any evidence that white evangelicalism is liberal in any way, moving to the left in any way, moderating in any way. And I know both you guys are, know the intricacies of the Southern Baptist Convention. I think every year there's more evidence that they're becoming even more conservative at the elite level of the SBC, or trying to drive out any sort of not fundamental. By the way, Sam, I like the distinction between fundamentalist and conservative. I think a lot of times we're pushing the conservatives out to leave the fundamentalists left. And I think that's what's happening in most white evangelical spaces right now.
Yeah, you've brought up a really good point. There is this, vague term that is conservative evangelical, and it's getting harder and harder to define because it's this catch-all term that people define differently. So you almost have to come out and say, I'm a conservative evangelical, and here's how I define that, right? So,
yes.
But the difference to me between fundamentalism and being an evangelical is an evangelical desires to interact with the world, whereas a fundamentalist has a purifying, separatist, my way or the highway kind of attitude. So it's almost tone that separates the two in many ways, not necessarily doctrine, because there are plenty of fundamentalists who hold to the fundamentals of the faith, just like I do. But how we approach the world, it's a worldview thing. It's not necessarily a doctrinal thing. It can be doctrinal in some circles, but it's more worldview. And what I'm seeing in the Southern Baptist Convention, and we'll just keep using them as an example, they're big, so it's kind of like the one bellwether, if you will, is a move to a more isolationist, separatist, very restrictive sort of view that's less encompassing of what used to be a big tent mentality. And I think as a Southern Baptist, I think it's to our detriment. I know you're just giving the facts. I'll be the opinion commentator here. I think it's to our detriment. And I think that's part of the problem in some tribes, not all tribes, but some tribes, is this hard right fundamentalist shift that is even pushing out true conservatives who feel like they have no place now.
I will say, from a sociological perspective, the fundamentalist impulse is actually very counterproductive. And let me explain that from just like take theology out of it for a second. What you want for a religious group is this. You want them to still interact with the world at some point. It not completely, but you want to rub up against the culture as much as you can. It does two things that are really important. One is it gives you the opportunity to evangelize from the larger culture into your tribe. Evangelicals love to evangelize, or they should. That's their name, right?
Theoretically.
Theoretically. Two, it actually gives the people inside your group a constant reminder of how different they are from the larger culture and creates stronger ties inside that group. So it actually increases retention amongst your own people if they interact at some level with the larger culture. So it's actually like a double benefit of doing that. There's a great book in the came out around 2000 called Christian Smith wrote it, Evangelicals Embattled and Thriving, which I think is a great like encapsulation of like how their posture was in the 1990s, which is like, let's hit the culture enough and rub up and create friction with the culture enough to maybe pull some people into our tribe, but also create those stronger bonds inside ourselves. And that's what carried us forward. Fundamentalism does the opposite of that. It says, no, you can literally go to hell over there. I'm going to create our own little version of heaven over here, and you can do whatever you want over there. That gives you no chance to evangelize the culture, but it also kind of weakens the ties of the people there because it's like you don't see what you're rebelling against or what you're standing up against as much. So I just think from a pure numerical perspective and a sociological theory perspective, the old posture of evangelicalism was much more productive in growing the faith and maintaining the faith than this current cloistering we're seeing and further, purification that's been going on the last 10, 15 years.
Fascinating stuff. Hey, since I'm the old guy in this room, my first presidential political battle that I have any recollection of, because I was only 5 years old, was Kennedy and Nixon. In 1960. For some reason that I shouldn't remember that much in 1950, and I don't know how much of it is historical extrapolation, but I think I remember a whole lot about that. I remember my parents talking to me about the yays and nays, especially of having a Catholic president in JFK. The first one where I voted was Ford and Carter.
Did you vote for Gerald Ford, Tom?
I did vote for Gerald Ford.
You realize Gerald Ford is like the luckiest guy on the history of the planet because he like never ran for anything and became president?
Yes, I do. Spiro Agnew made the way, then Richard Nixon made the way. Most people don't even know who Spiro Agnew is.
Yeah, he evaded taxes and he lost his
Vice
job.
President should not evade taxes.
Pay your taxes. Hey, if there's any upshot from this whole thing, don't be a fundamentalist and pay your taxes and life will be just fine.
Yes, that was my first vote, and that was my first memory. I think I think you two are political animals more than I am, but I still enjoy it.
Well, I mean, you got to realize now that religion is downstream of politics. Like I'm writing a book right now, and I just finished a section where I basically make the argument that politics is the master identity now. Like it's the first lens in our eyes, and now we view everything downstream of politics. So what church we go to, if we go to church, is really dependent on who we vote for on election day. 45% of Biden voters are atheist agnostics or say that religion is nothing in particular. 45% of the Democratic coalition is nones now. It's 12% of the Republican coalition. So it's becoming harder and harder to be a white Christian Democrat. The share, they used to be 40% of the population were white Christian Democrats, and now it's only 20% of the population are white Christian Democrats. Like that whole like white Catholic Kennedy coalition thing from the 60s and 70s that kind of hung around. Those people are long dead now. They've been replaced by younger white Christians who are overwhelmingly conservative and vote for conservative candidates. So it's just amazing to me, like how the interplay of these things, there's so many pieces. It goes to gender and race and religion and income and education. And part of my job is to try to like pull all that apart and hopefully make a little bit of sense to us about, the one thing I get more the gratification from is when I give a talk and I see someone's like, they can see in their head, like, oh, this all makes sense now. Like I get why I feel this way and I get where I'm fitting in the larger macro level story of what's going on in America. And I think that's the joy of statistics is I can show you trend lines for 50 years. Now, Sam can show you those trend lines. People say, I don't believe you, but the data is what the data is. And I don't care. I always tell people, I don't care how you feel about it. I really don't. Because it is as close we can get is to empirical reality is through this. Is it perfect? It is not perfect. Is it better than the alternative? It is better than the alternative. So that is how we construct. By the way, no one can look back at history and give an objective view of it because you only have your perspective as a person, as a white person, as a male person, as a Christian person, as a Democrat or Republican. You can't see the whole story. And the one thing that statistics can do for us is show us a better, bigger picture of what was going on in all of America at the time, not just your little slice of it. And if you disagree with that, then you're saying that, you know what? I want to construct my own version of reality, which I grew up in a Southern Baptist church, and I was told that all truth is God's truth and that relative truth is bad. I'm trying to give you objective truth. So grab onto it, people, and enjoy it, I guess.
What is funny to me, and I will conclude my thoughts with this one, is how many fundamentalists are acting the same as relativists because they refuse to look at the truth in front of them and accept it as truth.
All right, Sam, that's your gotcha close it moment. So please do.
Can I piggyback on that just a second, Sam?
Do it,
there's something called the horseshoe theory of public opinion now. It used to be like left and right are like a stick, right? Left's on the far left of the stick, right's on the far right of the stick. There's a new theory developing that public opinion is actually a horseshoe, but the far left and the far right are actually a lot closer together than we think they are. And I think there's a lot. Think about this. Who used to be anti-vax 20 years ago? Hippies, right? Super crunchy, organic, liberal people. Who's anti-vax today? Far right people. You know, there's lots of areas in which the two ends of the stick are like coming together. And I think, you know, the fundamentalist thing, like, oh, we believe in absolute truth, but like they're sounding a lot more like relativists, you know, every day it feels like. And I think that's an interesting thing. Like the extremes in America are not as far as polarly opposite as we think they are. They actually might be coming from the same general idea, just expressing it in a slightly different way. That's a weird thought. And the more you think about that, by the way, you're going to see instances of that in your daily life. You're like, wow, that's happening a lot right now.
All right. So drag queens and Southern Baptists are coming together at the polar ends of that horseshoe. So you heard it from Ryan Burge.
I did not. Sam said that. I love all you Southern Baptists. Please invite me down. I love Alpharetta. I've been there many times. I'll come again. Thank you.
Fair enough. And that was a joke if anyone is taking me too seriously. So what you can take seriously is a wonderful company called Tithely. They provide some amazing resources for churches. They have their online systems are phenomenal. So go just Google Tithely, go check them out. But you also want to click on the link in the show notes to get their 2023 State of Church Giving report. It is a wonderful report. It is free. You should absolutely get this and read it. It's a great resource. Certainly want to thank Ryan Burge for being on the show, and we'll catch you all in the next episode.